Hello everyone and welcome back into yet another edition of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard as always. Thank you all for tuning into today's show, and it should be a good one here on this Tuesday afternoon of February 11th. We'll be starting off by talking about my own personal QB big board. Not necessarily the guys who expect to go that highly. We are going to talk about Cam Ward a little bit, but some of the guys potentially going in later rounds who might potentially see their stock either rise or plummet as we continue with these combine workouts, we continue with these bowls, continue with such and such. So it should be an interesting segment. Then we can talk about the potential Cooper Kupp landing spots. Myles Garrett not the only high-profile star on the trade market right now. A lot of interesting places he could end up. Then we'll be previewing tonight's Knicks-Pacers showdown. Very different tenor to it than the playoff series last year. Then when we start doing a new segment here on the show called Bubble Watch, we're getting into March Madness territory here, folks. So throughout this entire week, I'm going to be updating you on the teams currently on potentially the outside looking in a lot of different conferences. And today we start off with perhaps the most top-heavy of those conferences, the SEC. And we conclude by looking at tomorrow's slate, because today's slate is going to be happening throughout our show of Champions League knockout playoff phase games. A lot of interesting ones tomorrow. Maybe not the best, considering the fact that Real Madrid and Man City's contest is just kicking off in a couple of minutes, but ultimately should still be a good segment to close out today's show. But before we get into any of that good stuff, I do want to remind you, as always, to like, follow, and subscribe if you haven't done so already and you want to keep up to date with all our new content, not just from my show, but around the network. And also consider availing yourselves to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube to contribute and interact with the show a little bit more directly. As always, the best way to get your opinions, feedback, and input out there, as always, just makes our shows that much better. But without further ado, let's jump right into our first segment, our own personal QB big board here at the show, and it should be a good one. Like I said, we're going to be talking about a guy like Cam Ward, what his draft stock is going to be looking like over the next couple of months, but ultimately some other guys, two other guys who I'm really interested to see in terms of their draft stock over the coming months before the draft, because they really are intriguing. And considering the fact that the landscape of this QB class is not necessarily groundbreaking, I do feel like the guys we'll be talking about outside of Cam Ward have a better chance of getting picked a little bit earlier than one would expect, because of this very thin QB market in this year's draft. So without further ado, let's start talking about them. First, though, we do have to talk about Mr. Cam Ward, because he is considered QB1 or QB2 if you think Shedeur Sanders is better in this year's draft class. But I'm not necessarily certain both the Titans and Browns are the top picks in the draft and are potentially teams looking to be in the quarterback market are content on picking him or someone like an Abdul Carter or Travis Hunter to improve their team. So let's talk about Cam Ward, because he's going to be an interesting prospect. A lot of people still view him as potentially being the number one overall pick. But right now, considering the fact that we've heard so many different rumors about both the Titans and Browns, two teams who could be in the Cam Ward sweepstakes at the top of the draft, I feel like his chances of falling a little bit lower than we would expect, potentially all the way to the Giants at 3, or maybe even lower if other teams consider taking the best player available ahead of, say, more QB-needy teams like the Raiders, so to speak. Then this could be an interesting situation where Ward could see not necessarily his draft stock plummet, but the number that he's called at plummet. And it's nothing against him, right? If you draft him, you're getting an incredible prospect with a steely demeanor in big moments, the leading passer last year in the FBS, the leading passing touchdown guy in terms of how many he had, and he just creates in certain moments that you want him to. Yes, there are caveats in terms of his decision making. He makes some head scratching plays, but you are still getting perhaps the most elite QB in this draft, a guy who certainly, if you develop enough around him, could be your franchise QB for years to come. But whether or not he's number one is going to be the question. I think that the Titans are a team that are getting a little iffy about whether or not they want to retain their number one pick or potentially use it on someone else outside of the QB market. They are a very QB needy team, but maybe Travis Hunter, Abdul Carter appeals to them a bit more. They have a lot of areas of need, so Cam Ward might not necessarily be in their minds as of right now. And if they trade out of the pick, they might just look for free agency to help them out at the QB spot. A lot of talk about potentially Aaron Rodgers using that as a surprise destination to go to, but who knows? And then the Browns, yes, they're also a QB needy team, but because of Deshaun's immovable contract at this point, and because of the fact that Myles Garrett is requesting a trade, they could go for someone like an Abdul Carter right now, should they lose Garrett. So right now, the team is most likely in on Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders, so to speak, are the Giants and Raiders. And for both those fan bases, it falls out exactly like they would want him to. But for Cam Ward, it's going to be interesting to see if the Titans and Browns even consider thinking about him as well. But for now, he's a prospect who remains the QB1 in this class, but it depends on whether or not the Titans or Browns are willing to risk their franchises basically on this guy, probably in a different class who wouldn't necessarily be in this conversation right now. Now let's talk about another guy, potentially quickly becoming the QB3, rising up a lot of people's draft board, potentially into the first round, where a team like, say, a Pittsburgh takes a risk on him. How about Jackson Dart? And speaking of how he rose the ranks to potentially become the QB3 in this year's draft is through the Senior Bowl. Really impressed a lot of people with his arm strength and verticality at the Senior Bowl. But ultimately, concerns have arisen around him, considering the fact that he was more so in a scheme under Lane Kiffin that tailored to the college game a little bit more than, say, a pro-style offense. So that's going to be a big question that he has to answer continuously, not just in a Senior Bowl setting against the top talent in college, but in combine workouts and in other areas of his draft process. Because as much as Jackson Dart has really been impressive, one of the top QBs in the SEC over the past 2 years, perhaps in many people's minds the top QB in the SEC over the past couple of years. And we know he has the arm strength. We know he has the accuracy to all different levels of the field. It's going to come down to how he begins to process the jump from college to the NFL. It's going to intrigue a lot of teams if he gets that part of the process right. But for now, he remains a bit of a question mark in terms of his draft stock, to me, at the very least, because a lot of people see him rising up the rankings. But to me, I still feel he's a little bit of an unknown entity until we start to see how evaluators and scouts view him in the draft process. So for now, I'm putting a question mark next to his QB3 status, and I want to see more out of his workouts, his interviews over the next couple of months to assure that he deserves to be in the QB3 conversation behind Ward and Sanders, potentially a late day one pick. But for now, I really think that Jackson Dart has set a platform for himself that he wants to cross over. And if he crosses over that platform, that threshold, he could potentially be a sneaky option for some teams looking towards the bottom of round one. And it could lead to a shock pickup from a team like, say, Pittsburgh or even Seattle, or maybe even a surprise team as well, down low in these rankings for, actually not the rankings, but the round. But ultimately, I still am a little bit iffy about how he's going to transition to the NFL. But he's an interesting guy that I wanted to bring up outside of the big two, outside of some guys who, might be appealing later, say, in round 5, because he has truly cemented himself as the questionable QB3. And I want to call that into question. Now let's get to a guy whose status really is up in the air, hovering around QB7 right now. I know him all too well, Quinn Ewers. And this is a guy whose draft stock can change mightily over the next couple of months. whether it be through his interviews where scouts and evaluators will probably most likely fall in love with him, and then in his combine workouts where he's sure to show he's not just part of a scheme that Sark set up for him with his arm strength. And the most important aspect of why evaluators and scouts love his games, because in the big moments he did show up. For example, against Alabama on the road his junior year, probably his best performance in the Big 12 championship game, the most passing yards in a game of his career. And then against Arizona State in the critical moments, 4th and 13, gotta have a moment, he delivered as well, in both overtimes for that matter. But then again, we look at Sark's scheme, when we look at how it became a little bit more run heavy, we look at how Quinn started to throw a lot of passes behind the line of scrimmage, especially last year. We talk about all the injuries that might have impacted how accurate, how deep he can throw the football. We talk about, all of those aspects of his game. That's the reason why a lot of people are saying that he might fall a bit lower, but potentially in terms of the combine aspects of it, in terms of how he works out, in terms of how he interviews, in terms of how he appeals to, say, the average NFL scout, that's where it could get intriguing. Because a lot of people are saying that Quinn Ewers is most likely a round 4 to 5 guy because of the way he's handled himself throughout his college career, because of the big moments in his college career, because of the way he's handled this Arch situation, especially because of how he handled himself in front of the media, dealing with that. Maybe that appeals to more NFL scouts who like that part of a quarterback's attitude, like that part of a quarterback's makeup more than, say, the average pundit who is just viewing it through their play and their style of play, most importantly, that makes Quinn Ewers such an unknown. I think that because of the fact that evaluators and scouts are most likely going to fall in love with him throughout the process, that we could see him enter the late round 2, early day 3 debate here. So I think that out of all these 3 quarterbacks, Quinn Ewers could prove to be the most volatile in terms of where he goes. But I didn't want to present all of these 3 guys because even though we talked about Cam Ward first and he's most likely going to be the first QB off the board, I wanted to bring up both Dart and Ewers because they're the most volatile in my opinion in terms of where they could end up. Let me know what you think in the comments below about these 3 quarterbacks, where they could end up going, and whether or not you think their draft stock will rise or plummet, because coming up next, we transition to another topic concerning the NFL, where Cooper Kupp might end up out on the trade market. It should be a good one right after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I want to remind you, as always, to consider availing yourselves to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. That's always the best way to contribute and interact with our shows a little bit more directly. You can also do it through our website, gsmcspodcast.net. You don't also have to leave your opinions, feedback, input as well. Tips and donations are also genuinely appreciated for all those concerned around the network, and it just makes our shows that much better when you, our faithful audience, are interacting with them. So without further ado, let's jump right into our second segment, continuing with this football narrative. Where could Cooper Kupp end up? Obviously, recently just informed that he was on the trade market by the Los Angeles Rams, and I know that a lot of teams, even though Cooper Kupp is one of those guys who's more of a possession-based receiver, getting up there in age, and that might have been the reason why the Los Angeles Rams were looking to ship him off, that could be desperate enough to want his services, and also consider themselves more of a contender should they acquire him. But I do think that when you think about a guy like Cooper Kupp, you have to think about a team that really buys into the philosophies that Cooper Kupp exudes. He's going to be a guy who's not going to be the flashiest superstar wide receiver you could get out on the market. He's going to be a guy that just moves the chain steadily. And if you're an offense that likes that and preaches that, then maybe he's the guy for you. But if you are an ambitious offense and you want to be a little bit more pass heavy, then maybe you don't necessarily think about Cooper Kupp. And these four teams fall all along that kind of median here. They're either on one side or the other side, or they kind of are in the middle, or on the fence about potentially going out and picking him up. But I do think that any of these four teams will be positively impacted by the addition of a receiver like Kupp. So without further ado, let's jump right into them, starting off with one of the more intriguing options for Cooper Kupp, and a team that I do think could see themselves, if they acquire him, as a more pass-happy offense. How about the Dallas Cowboys? Brandon Cooks is a free agent, and CeeDee Lamb is someone who can't necessarily continuously carry this team on his own, and I know that there was an opportunity for the Dallas Cowboys to see more receivers after both him and Prescott went down, and guys like Jalen Tolbert looked exciting, but I do think that this would be an interesting piece to acquire, because while CeeDee Lamb is the flashier option, Cooper Kupp balances him out perfectly and gives Dak Prescott a more layered approach in the pocket, where one target is right at the sticks, exploiting the softness and say more zone looks, whereas CeeDee Lamb is more willing to take on someone in man-to-man coverage and beat them with his speed. And it will be allowed to as a result should they acquire a guy like Cooper Kupp. So the Cowboys are one of those teams where I find myself in the middle, on the fence with them, because they don't necessarily completely need Cooper Kupp, and I think with Brian Schottenheimer he can go either way. Very volatile at the OC spot over the years, and now he's the head coach. I really don't know how the tenor of this offense is going to look, but I do think that he will be, at the end of the day, an intriguing enough signing to add some diversity to this team if they choose to acquire his services. So I can't necessarily say that the Cowboys will be a terrible place for Cooper Kupp to end up, but I don't necessarily think it will be the best place considering this transition in offensive philosophies from, say, McCarthy to Schottenheimer, if you know what I'm saying. So while the Cowboys are definitely a team that could be in the sweepstakes, I just think that the way they're moving right now, we could see them come a little bit more run heavy, or they could decide to rely on the pass game a little more, and they might be a little bit more aggressive than others in trying to get Kupp for that very reason. So, who knows? But coming next is a team that clearly doesn't necessarily have to have Cooper Kupp, but will be even more deadly if they add him. And they might just be the best team in football, at least on the offensive side of things, if they acquire Cooper Kupp services, and that is the Baltimore Ravens. And I think that the Baltimore Ravens might just be one of the best teams in on Cooper Kupp, one of the best teams that people heard rumors about, because of the fact that if you add a guy like Cooper Kupp, it allows Zay Flowers and Rashad Bateman to continue to grow. It opens up things even for guys like Andrews and Likely in the middle of the field. And Cooper Kupp, at his age, doesn't necessarily have to be the number one option. Because that was the thing with the Rams. it was always a challenge between him and Nakua to see who would emerge as the number one receiver. And now that's clear that Sean McVay and this organization see Nakua as the number one option, chances are teams won't necessarily view him that way either. So the Ravens could be a team that are really intriguing because they don't need Cooper Kupp to be that guy for them all the time. And he can slot in next to Flowers and Bateman, who can exploit man-to-man coverage downfield, and he can be more of a possession-based receiver that could alleviate pressure on not just Lamar, but this offensive line that has a lot of questions about it heading into the offseason. So I do think that while the Ravens would, in many people's minds, become unfair if this happened, I really like the fit here. Because if this is not just the Ram decision and it's Cooper Kupp's, then I feel like this would be where he ends his career too, right? Because he's at the twilight of it and he really might not get top of the market money from a lot of these teams. So he has to take what he gets, and the Ravens could offer him a nice enough deal to where he's not necessarily paid like a wide receiver one anymore, but he can be ingrained into this team from the get-go as someone who could still contribute in the passing game. And the Ravens will love it because not only does this really make their passing game deadly, but also make this running game deadly as well. Because Kupp opens up a lot of things in the run game, especially in second and third and short situations, to where you can call a lot more diverse plays than you would without a guy like Kupp. So that's why I really think the Ravens situation will become even better with Kupp in it. But let's talk about a team that certainly is a little bit more of a long shot, but I still think that if Cooper Kupp is added to its ranks, could really make this one of the more creative offenses in the NFL. The Denver Broncos. And we know that Sean Payton would rather a joker type of player where he has a running back or tight end who is a little bit more versatile in both the run game and the receiving game respectively than, say, your typical possession-based receiver. But I do think that we saw out of the Denver Broncos offense as Bo Nix improved throughout the season, as he started to trust Sean Payton a little bit more, was a lot of plays, the short to intermediate areas of the field that were on timing-based routes. I feel like if they want to continue that narrative, at least in the quote-unquote downfield passing game, then Cooper Kupp is the best security blanket for a guy like Bo Nix. And I really feel that if Denver continues to be aggressive in building up their homegrown talent and relying on talent through the draft, then this pick might not make any sense. But ultimately, I do think that if you want to continuously attack the middle of the field with Bo Nix, you're going to want a couple more receivers who fit that mold, and Kupp is the perfect one. He's not going to be the youngest player in this offense by any long shot, but it certainly opens up a lot of avenues as to what Sean Payton can call for Bo Nix in the second year of his career. And you want to see improvement from a guy like Bo Nix, right? If you're Sean Payton and company, because if he stagnates, that shows that maybe investment in him proves unwise down the stretch for you. So you want to make sure that he has players who are not just youthful and are buying into the Sean Payton narrative, but players who have the experience and can help him out and help him grow and mature continuously in the league. And Cooper Kupp could be that for him. So while I do think that there's something to the Broncos building through their homegrown talent and relying on their depth in terms of their youth, I do think the addition of Kupp would really help this team experience-wise, especially a guy like Cooper Kupp, who's still growing into the league. And the fact that they made the playoffs a little bit ahead of schedule makes this a lot more of an appealing destination to Cooper Kupp. And here, he would not necessarily be the number one receiver, but he certainly could bring out the best in a lot more guys, like, say, Mims and Vele, who will then be allowed to have more freedom in the passing game themselves. So this could be an interesting situation here for Denver. And last but not least, I think this is the simplest answer to the potential landing spots for Cooper Kupp. It's the Buffalo Bills. The Buffalo Bills are a team that over the years have been very aggressive in the wide receiver market, picking up Diggs, picking up Cooper mid-season this year. But I do feel like because of this shift in offensive philosophy, because of how Joe Brady has utilized Josh Allen, how he's utilized the run game, how he's limited Josh Allen's turnovers, this makes a lot of sense because Cooper Kupp is not going to be the number one receiver who goes down the field on every single route, runs the go route, the post routes for you. No, he moves the chains consistently like Josh Allen would want him to, and most importantly, defines a little bit more of the other receivers in this receiving room. Khalil Shakir becomes more of a definitive yak kind of guy, whereas Keon Coleman could be seen as more of a downfield threat himself. And Dalton Kincaid and Cooper Kupp could be the exploiters of the soft coverages they face. So ultimately, if I'm Joe Brady, if I'm Sean McDermott, I'm chomping at the bit to get a guy like Cooper Kupp in the squad as they continue to shift the mindset of this team offensively, because I feel like that if they continue on this route, their Super Bowl window will remain open, and most importantly, Josh Allen will continue to play at an MVP caliber level. But it all depends on how Cooper Kupp feels, how the Rams feel, and the offers they get for him. But let me know what you think about this situation in the comments below. Because coming next week, we switch over to the world of basketball for a little bit. Talking Knicks-Pacers. Interesting game tonight with a completely different tenor from their playoff series just a couple of months ago. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about it.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of today's show, we transition to the world of basketball, specifically the NBA, to preview an intriguing matchup in the Eastern Conference between two kind of fringe contenders, one more so than the other, Knicks Pacers. And the reason I wanted to highlight this game specifically, amidst all the trade deadline noise where both of these teams kind of stood pat, is because it has a completely different tenor to their very hyped up playoff series just a couple of months ago, really. Both of these teams in drastically different places, where the Knicks feel like they're a team that could compete for the Eastern Conference, and the Pacers feel like they still have the talent to, but aren't necessarily living up to the standards they set for themselves. So in this matchup, with both teams feeling like they can still contend, but one actually proving it more than the other, I feel like this game is to come under a little bit more heavy scrutiny, even though it's lost its luster a little bit, this rivalry. So let's start off by talking about how these teams come into these couple of games. The Knicks right now potentially seen as, well, not necessarily after that embarrassing loss at home to Boston a couple of nights ago, seen as one of the hottest teams in the NBA. That loss aside, I believe they had won 8 straight games. Jalen Brunson, Karl-Anthony Towns really in their bag, playing hyper-efficient basketball the Tom Thibodeau way, and really looking like a team that could make some noise in the Eastern Conference. Whereas this Pacers team kind of has stumbled over the past couple of weeks. They're 2-2 in their last 4 games. And to prove to you the volatility of this 2025 iteration of the Indiana Pacers, it trailed by 15 or more in all 4 games and 20 or more in the last 3. And several of those games were comebacks, actually. A lot of the time, the Pacers had the offensive talent to keep these games and split their past 4. But ultimately, it's their defense that's been letting them down. That's always been the case with this Pacers team. They're 21st in defensive rating, and going up against this Knicks offense that, yes, lacks depth, but still, you might say, is the best starting 5 potentially in the entire NBA. I don't necessarily like the look of this compared to last year when your offense could just about outscore anybody and really made that series a series. And the reason why it went 7 games, because those guys in that starting 5, the Tyrese Halliburtons of the world, the Pascal Siakams of the world, the TJ McConnells of the world, refused to lose that series. But now, the tables have turned. And even though this season they split the first 2 meetings, and the Pacers get this one at home as their final home game, in fact, before the All-Star break, I do feel like the Knicks have more momentum. Yes, they got knocked back a little bit. They got a bit of a reality check. At home, in fact, against the Boston Celtics. And it's the second time this season where the Boston Celtics have really had their way with this Knicks team. And it's going to be called into question whether or not this Knicks team truly has what it takes to take the Eastern Conference this year and have their championship window be open for a certain period of time over the next 5 or so years. But ultimately, they're still only 2.5 back of Boston. They're 4.5 ahead of the Pacers. So, in a spot where they feel like they're reaching new horizons. Now, the reason I bring up last year's series is because that series was a defining rivalry, and it really brought both of these teams into the forefront, right? And it really promised, most importantly, 2 teams that would not let this Eastern Conference stagnate and become, say, the Boston Celtics conference to have for the next number of years. And right now, while it could remain that way because both these teams are very likely to go into the postseason with very high hope potentially of making a run at this thing, it's not like last year where you felt that both of these teams could have stood a chance against Boston, but ultimately didn't have enough. It's more so like the Eastern Conference is so crowded that I really don't know how to define these 2 teams as contenders. I feel like the New York Knicks stand a chance in this year's Eastern Conference, but when I look around at the depth of it, it's really puzzling to discern whether or not they actually can. And the Pacers right now have regressed so much that I really can't say the starting 5 is good enough to carry them like they did last year. And so I'm looking at a game like this going, this could have been a very important and pivotal game before the All-Star break. And it technically is, right? The Knicks want to stay within touching distance of Boston in second, and the Pacers still want to make some noise, not just in the playoff race, not just in the Eastern Conference, but to ensure that they remain firmly in, at the very least, the play-in spots. But right now, I feel like this game is more so meaningless because of the fact that no matter how these teams profile against each other, it's the rest of the Eastern Conference they should be worrying about. And especially 2 teams that feel like they could have stood pat at the trade deadline and weren't necessarily aggressive enough. For example, if I'm the Knicks, I feel like I need more depth, especially, in my opinion, defensively for the non-Towns minutes ahead. Because Towns really, even though a lot of people are saying that he doesn't necessarily have to carry the Knicks as much as people initially thought, he still has to remain hyper efficient whenever he's out there because they really don't necessarily have the depth at the center position to compensate for when he's off the court. And then you look at a guy like Jalen Brunson, who's the ultimate heartbeat of this team, and how he really has no backup options. You're looking at guys on this depth chart like Pacom Dadier, like Jericho Sims, like Landry Shamet, who might have to be called into question come postseason. That's not something, if you're the Knicks, you really want. But you're firmly relying upon the stars you do have, the moves you did make in the offseason, where you fully bought into this Tom Thibodeau identity and you're relying on these stars to play 40-plus minutes a night. And they're highly capable of doing it, right? But to what extent does it hurt your chances in the Eastern Conference? And so that's why I feel like this game for the Knicks is very questionable in my mind. Because I do feel like they'll win it, but I feel like the importance of it's going to be lost on them because of the fact that they didn't necessarily address some issues in the trade situation, where the trade deadline situation rather, where they could have bolstered their depth. But really they are starting to become, at the very least, a team that has an identity. We're going to go out there with our starting five. We're going to play 40 minutes. We're going to play a tough physical 40 minutes at that. And hopefully that's going to be enough to where our backups can't hurt us and our lack of depth can't hurt us. So it's a very interesting approach. And for now it's working. But against teams in the Eastern Conference that really can shock you, I don't know how this Knicks team holds up. And then when I look at the Pacers, this team really is a fringe contender now, and they could be on the outside looking in at contender status come postseason time. Not saying that they're not going to make the postseason. They'll at least make the play-in, in my opinion. But for now, they're constantly, in my mind, a team that is plummeting down the tier list. And we'll talk about the tiers of contention next week in the NBA. But I feel like if you're the Indiana Pacers, you can't necessarily feel like this team's infrastructure right now is good enough in this highly competitive Eastern Conference. They're a team that I feel is slightly similar to the Knicks' philosophies and have skewed to them a little as of late, but they're not pulling it off as effectively as, say, the Knicks are. I do feel like this is a team, right, where they can get her rolling at any time, but Tyrese Halliburton has regressed. Pascal Siakam has too much pressure on him to deliver when Tyrese Halliburton is not effective. And guys like Nembhard and McConnell have clearly declined in their efficiency for this team. And I feel like, a lot of Pacers fans might be saying, well, this team is made for the playoffs, and it's the reason why they profiled so well last year. I don't necessarily see it this year, because this team is not like last year's team where they at least played decently enough defensively to where the offense could outscore the opposition. It's more so now hope that you don't get 130 put up on you and you don't score that much. It's more of playing catch up to where this Pacers team before did just enough offensively to win games to now where they're having to play catch up and as a result splitting more games they should be winning. So when these two teams face off against each other tonight, it's going to have a much different meaning, and it's not necessarily, in my opinion, going to be as important to their playoff hopes or tell us anything new about these teams. But what I will be looking for in tonight's matchup is which of these teams' philosophies is more likely to stick and most likely to actually mean something in the next 3 to 5 years. Because both of these teams have the blueprint set out for them. Potentially the Knicks more so than the Pacers right now. But if the Eastern Conference continues to get better, how will these teams find themselves 3 to 5 years down the road? And I feel like right now, them standing pat at the trade-in line says a lot about how they feel. But if you're a Knicks or Pacers fan, chime in. I definitely want to hear from you most of all about tonight's game and about how both of these teams could profile heading into the postseason. But coming next, we're talking some college hoops here. Starting to get into bubble watch territory, guys. Starting off with potentially the top heaviest of conferences, the SEC, and who to look out for over the next couple of months. Be right back after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And today we're going to be starting a series of sorts because March Madness is nearing ever closer. Throughout the week, we're going to be looking at different conferences and the teams to watch in terms of whether or not they're on the bubble. And we start off perhaps the most loaded conference in all of college basketball, the SEC. Who would have thought that the SEC would not just excel in college football, but college basketball as well? But that is how things stand right now. And we look at the SEC, we look at it in terms of depth, because a lot of these teams you would already say are locks. They're already in the AP polls consistently. There are a lot of teams right now just rounding into form at the right time. A lot of players impressing as well. And you feel that there are a lot of locks. There are still some teams on the periphery, potentially with work to do, or teams that should be in, considering how the last couple of weeks could pan out for them in the conference tournament as well. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. Bear with me in advance if I get some things about these teams wrong, get their schedules potentially wrong, but we learn together, right? We learn as all this different news is coming out about who should be in, who should be out, right? Without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off, of course, with the locks. Now, like I said, this is a very top-heavy conference. You have the Auburns and Alabamas of the world facing off against each other in a couple nights' time. First ever time that I believe an AP number 1 and number 2 faced off against each other and they were in the same conference. Then you have teams like the Florida Gators, the Tennessee Volunteers, building around certain players. For Tennessee, Chaz Lanier, is he the new Dalton Knecht? For Florida, the inside-outside duo of Walter Clayton Jr. and Alex Conn, who's really been impressive over these past couple of games. Then you finally have the Texas A&M Aggies not worrying about having to be a bubble team anymore, not worrying about having to potentially win or look good in their conference tournament anymore, and under the leadership of Buzz Williams, finally having this crop of guys like Wade Taylor IV, like Manny Obaseki, finally break through and confirm their March Madness status before the conference tournament. And a team in Kentucky I really like, have a very impressive win over Duke. Yes, there was not the same Duke team as a couple of months ago, but still a very impressive win on their resume. Otega Owe, Jackson Robinson, Andrew Carr, the nucleus of this team. I really like how competitive they could be. I consider them a team that could potentially make it all the way to the Final Four themselves. Well, now let's talk about the teams that currently are on the periphery. The teams that should be in, the teams with work to do, and teams that are on the outside looking in. And I think the teams that should be in right now are the teams that right now most likely could be locks, but just have a couple questions to be asked about them. And the one that I want to highlight right now is the Texas Longhorns. And this Texas Longhorns team hasn't necessarily looked good as the calendar is flipped to 2025. They've lost 7 of 11 games, and they've lost to teams also in bubble watch, at least for the SEC Conference. Ole Miss we're talking about, Arkansas, Vanderbilt we're going to talk about a little bit later in this segment as well. And this is a team that, like we've seen, can find themselves firmly in lock territory, but have slipped up a little bit. They're still at 91%, but some forecasts have them now in the mid-80s as well. And looking at their strength of record, it's definitely not one of the best in the conference. They have a strength of record barely in the top 50, and it's only going to get tougher starting tonight at 9 p.m. against Alabama, the number 2 team in the land. And my big question about them is, if their star is a freshman guard and Trey Johnson, can the transfer they brought in, like Caden Shedrick, the Virginia transfer, or Arthur Kaluma, the Creighton transfer, build around him and help him in terms of how they play against these top teams? Because you can't always rely on a guy like Trey Johnson, let alone a freshman, to lead you, unless you're, say, the Duke Blue Devils or something like that. So that's what I'm looking for here at Texas, because I firmly believe that they'll have a good seed in March Madness, but I want to see how they play and coalesce around their star Trey Johnson in the big game starting tonight against Bama. Then we take a look at an Ole Miss team that is steadily winning enough games to stay in the 80 to 90% range in terms of being locks. But I do want to see more impressive wins out of them. Their schedule does ease up a little bit over the next couple of weeks, but then they have Vanderbilt and Auburn in very pivotal games toward the end of the month. They're staying right on the periphery. This is a very balanced team led by star guard Sean Padula, a very experienced team. A lot of seniors on this roster, as we'll find throughout our look into the SEC's depths. But ultimately, because of the fact that they're number 18 in SOR and number 21 in net ratings, this is a team that's not necessarily too worried. And they have room for error a little bit. But I do want to see them against teams that are also on the outside looking in this conference, but also the big boys who are already locks. Ole Miss to truly step up. They're doing their job thus far, but I do feel like I want to see a little bit more about them when it matters, especially as we near March and Selection Sunday. Now let's get into the back end of the SEC. Teams with a little bit more work to do. Now we're talking about teams that could range from little less than 25% all the way up to 69%. And there are a lot of teams right now in the SEC that are just about getting the job done, but because of schedules ramping up in intensity, because perhaps they haven't looked good enough in certain games, haven't had enough quad one wins, not necessarily looking good in terms of net rating, strength of record, what have you. That's where the concern lies. So let's talk first about another very balanced, experienced team, not necessarily a team led by one superstar, in the Missouri Tigers. And I feel like this is a team that has a very strong record. This is a team capable of beating anybody, although they did lose to 2 top 25 teams, both within the SEC in the past couple of weeks against Tennessee and Texas A&M. Not the worst losses of all time, and their schedule does line up a little bit before, in a couple of weeks, a meeting between themselves and Alabama, still in the AP top 25 as of right now. But I do feel like, because of the fact that they have a couple of these big losses to top 25 teams, even though they were competitive in them, they might see their forecast slip right now. They're currently at 59%. They still rank top 20 in terms of strength of record. They have an above 500 record against top 100 opponents. Always a good indicator of how they could perform in March Madness. But BPI and other ratings do not necessarily have them as high. They're a team that are now at the back half of the AP Top 25, and if they don't consistently perform against all these top-heavy teams in the SEC, chances are you could see that number plummet a little bit, maybe below 50 over the next couple of weeks in terms of the chances for them to make the NCAA tournament. And then you have teams like Georgia and Oklahoma. The Sooners are on pace for an immaculate season for them, and I feel like in terms of ratings as well. They're a team to look out for as well. Then a team like Georgia, another ratings-based team, they're top 40 in strength of record. But how do all these different ratings groups view them? But the teams I definitely want to talk about on the back end are the teams like Arkansas and Vanderbilt. Arkansas, with a 40% chance, have one of the top players in the country, top freshman in the country in Boogie Flan. They're currently right now a team that I think needs to get hot, but they have one of the tougher schedules in the middle of February with Texas A&M, Auburn, and Missouri in a 3-week stretch before going up against Texas in a game that could potentially decide which of those two teams could find themselves in a better spot to make March Madness at large. But ultimately, I'm really excited to see how this Arkansas team, who over the past couple of weeks has been playing better, for example, ruining John Calipari's homecoming. We're actually winning John Calipari's return to Rep Arena as Arkansas head coach, and looking pretty impressive in a loss to Alabama, beating Texas before the end of month matchup, most importantly. So I'm looking at this Arkansas team as a team really volatile in terms of how they could look in the next couple of months. But I do want to touch upon this Vanderbilt team, because of all these teams, I like the look of them. Their inside-outside duo of junior Jason Edwards and Devin McLaughlin down low is really intriguing, but I do want to examine a little bit of their schedule, because they're a team that have not necessarily played well over the past couple of weeks against top 25 opposition. They got blown out by 30 a couple of weeks ago by Oklahoma. They got rocked by Florida a little bit. They do have an impressive win over Texas that puts them firmly in the debate. But listen to this upcoming schedule for the Vanderbilt Commodores. And how they navigate this gauntlet will be integral to their tournament chances. Because right now, number 17, even though the strength of record is looking pretty good, BPI has them 54th in the nation. It's 39th in strength of record. This is the gauntlet that will define the Vanderbilt Commodores season. Who would have thought that Vanderbilt would be exciting in both college football and college basketball? Well, listen to this gauntlet. On Saturday, the 15th, they play Tennessee. That could be a major game. Then they play Kentucky. Then they play Ole Miss. A game that I feel like they need to win to remain kind of in the should-be-in, work-to-do range. And then Texas A&M. So, if they, let's say, split this gauntlet, go 2-2, maybe even 3-1, Vanderbilt has an even better chance of seeing that number rise a little bit. And because of their previous strength of record compared to their future strength of schedule, that will kind of even itself out. But if they go 1-3, maybe even 500 could spell danger for them. I feel like we could see them on the outside looking in. But looking at all of these teams, I feel like out of all of them, Texas and Ole Miss are the most likely to see themselves find themselves in a lock position over the next couple of weeks. And in terms of the teams with the work to do, Missouri is certainly a very interesting team. Not necessarily a team relying on one superstar in the elite SEC, but still getting the job done. That could see momentum sway. And then talking about teams like Georgia and Oklahoma, we don't necessarily know how they'll pan out, but I am looking at the back end of this work to do range here with Arkansas and Vanderbilt, two very different teams with two very different future strengths of schedules who could find themselves in either advantageous or disadvantageous situations heading into their conference tournament. But let me know what you think about the SEC in terms of who you are monitoring over the next couple of weeks in terms of March Madness stats. Coming next, we transition across the pond to preview Wednesday's slate, tomorrow's slate of Champions League knockout playoff phases with today's slate of games going on right now. And right back to talk about that after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. And for our final segment of today's show, we're looking at a competition across the pond, the UEFA Champions League. The knockout playoff phases are underway right now. Unfortunately, because of the time constraints here with the show, I wasn't necessarily looking to talk about today's slate of games, but I can tell you that the Manchester City Real Madrid tie is already off to a flying start with Manchester City a goal up. So that's looking like a good tie. PSG dominating Brest in a Ligue 1 affair 3-0 earlier in the day. But we turn our attention to Wednesday's slate of games, and if anything happens in this slate of games, I will let you know. But this slate of games, not necessarily the most exciting, but there are narratives surrounding each and every single one of these matchups that I would like to key in on as we go along them. Whether it be from Celtic Bayern to Feyenoord Milan, I do feel like a lot of history, a lot of storylines, like I said, are involved in each and every single matchup. So without further ado, let's jump right into them. Starting off with that Celtic-Bayern matchup. Bayern lucky to avoid the two teams playing right now, City and Real Madrid, on their path to success, but they were most likely going to have to face teams like Leverkusen or Atletico, or even a team like Arsenal, even a team like Inter, who are the elites of this competition down the stretch. But avoiding Manchester City and Real Madrid in this knockout playoff phase and getting a team like Celtic definitely is a sigh of relief for a Bayern team that haven't necessarily gotten going in the Champions League. Created a lot of chances in their Champions League games, but have some baffling head-scratching losses in the league phase of this competition to Feyenoord and to Aston Villa. And I feel like questions going to be asked of Vincent Kompany if this team does not advance to the latter stage of this competition about his approach to the Champions League. Is he really ready for this competition? But I do feel like in this match against Celtic, at the very least, they'll have the favorite status, the heavy favorite. Because even though Celtic are a team that will be buoyed by the home support at Celtic Park in that leg of the tie tomorrow, I do feel like they're up against it with this Bayern team that's too creative in certain areas, and Celtic, on the other hand, being a little bit too volatile. They certainly have a decent amount of players who could cause Bayern trouble. Their forward group is very versatile. I like the outlook of a guy like Daitse Maeda up top, but that back line with Austin Trusty, Cameron Carter-Vickers, castaways of recent years and recent leagues, I do feel like Bayern will look to dominate, much like Borussia Dortmund did in the league phase at Celtic Park in this competition. So I think that Bayern will get off to a flying start tomorrow. I see Vincent Kompany looking to rotate his team as the tie goes on, because Bayern have a lot of important ties coming up in the Bundesliga as well over the weekend, facing Bayer Leverkusen, and if they win that game, they take a commanding lead in the title race there. But I still think that Bayern at least wants to prove that they are true contenders in this competition, even if it's against a team like Celtic, because you don't necessarily want to look too bad in this tie. Then I look at a tie like Club Brugge Atalanta, where both of these teams could very well be considered the dark horses of this competition. And I look at how other teams around them profile, and I'm saying that the winner of this tie has a very good chance of being the dark horse of the competition. And I feel like Club Brugge is being underrated here. They could have been the team to knock out City on the final day of the league phase, and they were looking very likely to do so 1-1 at halftime, but obviously fortune turned to City's side, and they could not hold on. And then you look at Atalanta with a lot of impressive wins in the competition thus far, including a very impressive one against Atalanta, I believe, on match day 4 of the competition. I just think that when you look at how both of these teams profile, Atalanta just has the players, the shape, the manager, the tactical ability to overwhelm this Club Brugge side, even though Club Brugge should not sell themselves short in this tie. They clearly got here on merit. And being competitive enough in the league phase to advance. But when I look at Atalanta, this just spells dark horse all over it. Whether it be from Retegui, the creativity of Charles de Ketelara, or look at Ademola Lookman coming into this side, I just look at the profligacy and talent of this Atalanta team and say, this has all the makings of a dark horse. And Club Brugge can certainly make this an interesting tie. They certainly have their fair share of interesting players and guys like Hans van Aken and Onyedika. Excuse me. But when I think of Atalanta and the way they've looked in the league phase as well, and the path that they're going to be on should they advance, I'm thinking more highly of Atalanta in this tie rather than Club Brugge. Even though Club Brugge has proven they can hold their own in a league phase like this. And in future years, maybe it will be Club Brugge's year if they get a lucky draw and if they continue to prove that they have staying power in the competition as it transitions to this new league phase look, because they'll get more opportunities, and who knows, maybe the tie will come out in their favor. But I do feel like right now I'm leaning a little bit more towards Atalanta in this matchup to take over tomorrow in the first leg. Now let's talk about an interesting matchup here. Experience versus youth comes into play in this one. Monaco, the kind of surprise team in Ligue 1, going up against one of the most experienced teams in terms of the players on their squad, but also maybe in this competition in Benfica, one of Portugal's elite premier teams. Now, we talk about Monaco, we talk about the youth in this squad, how this team has relied on youngsters to really get them, and I'm going to look up a couple of these names because I do often forget about them. But you're looking at players who are younger than 25 really leading this team. You have guys like Magnus Akliush stepping up. You have Folarin Balogun. Actually, this is a very deep team with a lot of talent, but they still rely on guys like Akliush, Ben Sagir, George Linakena to step in and really help them out. But ultimately, going up against a Benfica squad with a lot of depth and, most importantly, experience, not just domestically but internationally in important competitions, with two prior World Cup winners in Angel Di Maria and Nicolas Otamendi, I think that Monaco will find their back up against it. But potentially, this could be the quote-unquote mini upset of the round, because Monaco does have a lot of talent outside of their youngsters in Balogun, Golovin in the midfield, and Bolo, another good forward, Zakaria, and a decent enough back line with a lot of depth there as well to really stand out in this tie. But it's going to come down to how both of these teams lean into their philosophies. Will Monaco need to rely upon their youngsters? Will Benfica trust their experience to get them through this tie? So that's why I think that this one is as much of an up-in-the-air affair as any other tie in the knockout playoff phases. And the last but not least, Feyenoord versus Milan. Obviously, Feyenoord with a very impressive win, but funnily enough, losing their top scorer in Santiago Jimenez to this AC Milan team. Now, this AC Milan squad is not necessarily the best in Serie A or in this competition by any stretch of the imagination. You know, you have the elite players in Rafa Leao and Christian Pulisic on the wings. You look at the midfield and it's alright. At the defense, you're relying on guys like Strahinja Pavlovic and Martial to really solidify things in the back line for you. Obviously, do have a talented goalkeeper in Mike Maignan, but I'm looking at this AC Milan team and I feel like they have enough to win this tie. And certainly with Santiago Jimenez now, the poaching of the striker to look forward to, I just feel like Feyenoord are more than the sum of their parts. Yes, they're going to be without their top scorer. He's going to be on the AC Milan touchline rather than their own. But Feyenoord is a team that I just can't get over in terms of how they've managed to overachieve. And they don't necessarily have a lot of top stars, but they do have an elite goalkeeper in Dustin Bijlow. I do like their defense. They still have Igor Pajau, Gernot Trauner, but ultimately it's just going to come down to if this team can overcome the loss of a player as talented as Santiago Jimenez was. Because AC Milan, even though they look much weaker than any other team from Italy in this competition, they still can look good in certain moments. And that's why in this specific tie, I'm really looking forward to seeing how Feyenoord attacks. But ultimately, not necessarily the most exciting of the two groupings of the Tuesday and Wednesday games, if you know what I'm saying, because you have Man City, Real Madrid, and currently Man City is 1-0 up in that game, and who knows what the future will hold for both of these teams in the second leg, because both of these teams really want to be looking to make deep runs in this competition. And then you have Juventus PSV, very underrated tie. Juventus currently 1-0 up there, where PSV is also another young team, a team that's proven to be more than the sum of its parts in this competition, that really has impressed in the latter stages of the league phase, going up against a Juventus team that's starting to round into form a little bit, but will have questions asked of it as it gets deeper into this competition. And Sporting Borussia Dortmund, pretty even tie there, although a lot of questions between both those two teams. But ultimately, let me know what you think about the Champions League this season and this knockout playoffs tie. But ultimately, this will do it for today's show. This has been the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been your host, Christopher Shepard. You know what to do: like, follow, subscribe. Continue to make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features, as well as our website, gsmcpodcast.net, for more updates and to contribute, interact with the shows a little bit more directly. But other than that, I'm out for today. See y'all tomorrow.